So thanks everyone for joining the fifth session of the LHI Online Developer Training for Fall 2016. And Bart and Mark are going to co-teach today.
Good day, everybody. This is Mark. Marina, should we just jump in?
Yes, please do.
Do you have any introductory? Okay. All right. Well, so we're in the class number 5, the last of the base level training for this course. As most of you know, there's 2 more supplemental trainings on A to J in the ensuing weeks that I hope a lot of you will join. Today our topics are methodology for developing templates, how to provide guidance to users, and continuing your education. And I'm going to do the first and third of those. Bart will handle the one in the middle. Before we start, though, let me just get my screen up. And I also want to ask if anybody has any questions or concerns before we dig into our new material, such as any questions about what happened last week. If you do, give us a note in chat or speak up, otherwise we'll just dig into today's content. So I've got on the screen the syllabus section for today, starting out with methodology, just sort of techniques for actually how to do these projects now that you've learned some of the technical aspects of making it happen. The providing guidance, as I said, Bart will get into how can you make information available to users as they're answering questions and guide them and alert them and warn them appropriately. Then finally, this continuing your education. How can you take what you've learned in this course and keep learning and grow your capacity to build these kinds of applications. I'm going to use a couple PowerPoint decks to cover my material. So starting with methodology, let me just bring this guy up. And I assume you're seeing my screen. Can somebody confirm?
Yes, Mark.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is pretty much the same topics in the syllabus, maybe in a different order, but talking about how can you ensure quality. Obviously, it's important when you're building applications that they work, they do what you intend, they don't misbehave, they give the users the kinds of information and documents they need. And then some standards and conventions you might consider following as you're building your applications. So as you've learned, there's a variety of different kinds of content that can be put onto WellHelp Interactive. First of all, you can have the user interface be a hot docs interview or an A to J interview. The document itself can be a Word document of some sort, RTF or DocX, or it can be a graphical form, a PDF template, or some applications actually just have an interview. They don't intend to generate a document. They're there to enlisted information, provide guidance, perhaps send somebody to a website, and there's no document generation intended at all, perhaps just some dummy summary of answers. Another aspect of variation to be aware of is who is your application for? Are you writing a tool that's designed for an advocate who's got expertise in a particular area, who's just using it as a productivity tool, which would make the interface perhaps not as important because they know what they're doing, they just want to get the job done? Is it designed for an advocate who perhaps is not an expert, but is routinely doing the same kind of application over and over? Again, that's going to drive the design of the experience and the nature of the documents. Or is it for a individual who's helping him or herself with a legal problem, in which case you want to be focused much more on plain language and ease of use, and you may be inclined to take the A to J approach as opposed to hot docs. So you've got a simpler experience for answering questions. Another possible audience are kind of people in between the self-helpers and advocates who act as navigators, who are there as helping other people use the system. So keep in mind as you build an application, who's it for, what's the context in which it will be used. Now language, LHI can support applications in almost any language. The overall LHI experience now can be turned into Spanish and several into Chinese and a couple of other languages. And you can control the language in your interview with anything that can be expressed as a Unicode character. So quite a wide space of variation of the kind of content that can be developed. Another thing, as I mentioned, is what's the context? What's the scenario in which the application will be used? Is it somebody sitting alone in their kitchen, or in a shelter, or a library, or a clinic of some sort using it? Is there somebody else with them that can help them navigate, or does it really need to be freestanding? And be aware that the computer that's being used on the end, or the device that's being used, is outside of your control. I see Miranda is chatting the fact that we now support Spanish, Chinese, Korean, and Mandarin. Users may come at the application via a smartphone, via a tablet, via a desktop computer. We can't control the application software they're using, whether they've got the latest version of Flash or the browser or PDF Adobe Reader, what word processor they have. So as you're building an application, just be aware that the universe of users and the situations they're in as they use your application is somewhat unpredictable. So try to construct an application that will behave itself reasonably well under all of those situations. One basic philosophical attitude to take when you're building applications is what's good about a template? What makes a good template? And I've got here on the screen just some common criteria. If this was interactive, I'd ask you to speak up, and feel free to jump in if you want. But obviously, a template or a piece of content in LHI is good if it's useful. It needs to do something that someone could find use in using. It needs to be usable so that it can be actually accessed by people to accomplish their goals. It should be substantively correct. It should be up to date, right? It's not out of date, it's not wrong. If you provide information or results or documents, they should be the proper things given what the user has said their situation is. You should have clarity on the scope of your application. So when someone starts the interview, they immediately know to what extent it fits their circumstances, and if it's something that is not going to handle all circumstances, which is true of most applications, the user is alerted early so they're not wasting their time using it inappropriately. It should be flexible, so if in fact you write an application to handle a certain common legal task, generating a letter or a pleading or giving advice of various sorts, it should flexibly adjust within the scope of use so that it doesn't break if someone answers a question in a way you didn't quite anticipate. And this is another aspect of correctness, but to the extent possible, you want to create applications that are as free of errors and as bulletproof as possible, so that there's really nothing a user can do that will break it, that will result in an error or an inappropriate bit of guidance or documentation. And then a final consideration is, from your perspective as a member of an organization that's investing time and energy in this, is it producing a return on investment? Is the time you will spend building the application going to result in service to the world or the community you serve, at least equivalent to the time you spent? Most applications on LHI return a high multiple return on investment. You may spend a few dozen hours building an application that will save hundreds, if not thousands of people, hundreds of hours. But think about the ROI, the return on investment of your application. Coming at this from more of a negative point of view is, okay, well, what can go wrong with an application you build? And what kind of misbehavior might you want to anticipate and try to avoid? There's really two sides to this. One is things going wrong with the interview itself, with the user experience of asking questions and getting guidance, and things that go wrong in the document. On the interview side, if a relevant question needed to either give information or produce a document isn't asked, that's an error. On the other hand, if you're asking questions that are not needed, if your application asks irrelevant questions given what's already known, that also should be seen as a mistake that you should want to try to avoid. It shouldn't be the case that the user has to answer the same information twice. So if you ask somebody's birth date, you shouldn't also need to ask their age, because that can be calculated. If you ask their zip code in one context, you shouldn't ask it again later, etc. Um, if the content, the tone of voice, or the level of verbiage is not appropriate for your target audience, that's something that can go wrong because people may not understand it. And of course, if the content that you give, if the information you provide is wrong or became wrong because the law changed or the practice changed, that's an error. On the document side, of course, if your document is the wrong document, given what the user has said, that's an error. If it's outdated, if you're using a form that's now been updated by the court or the agency, you've got a problem. Being poorly formatted may not be fatal for the user accomplishing their purpose, but a bad-looking document will not help a litigant in a case, and you obviously want to avoid that problem. If there are parts that belong in the document that your logic doesn't support, you've got an issue. There may have, this is like formatting, but if there's punctuation or cap sloppy or coming out wrong, again, because of the way you coded your template, that is a misbehavior to be avoided. And finally, if your document doesn't handle the lack of information, and this is a whole other area we could spend probably 2 hours on alone, but you need to, as you write an application, you need to anticipate the possibility a user may leave a question unanswered, especially if you don't require an answer. That's going to happen. What happens in your document? Is a blank line appropriate, or is there some alert or warning you should give the user? And how should you handle the unanswered questions? Some developers will trap various key questions that need to be answered and script their templates so that if those questions are not responded to, the document they get is not the document they want, but rather an alert saying, we're unable to produce your document because you haven't answered questions X, Y, and Z. Some of the complications, this is all easy to describe, but of course this is hard to do, like most things in life. Errors may not be that obvious. You may punctiliously script your application, carefully test it, but deep inside of it is some error you just have not anticipated. And downstream, while it's being used, it's going to perk up. And so just be aware you can't be perfect, you can't expect perfection. Just do your best. And some errors are just mere inconvenience. They produce a little bit of an oddity in the user experience or in the document. Others can be catastrophic, where you're actually putting, the exact opposite of what should be in a document because of the way you scripted it. As I mentioned, we don't control the user's desktop, so there are some things users will do, and in software environments they will have that'll make the application not work. And you just got to understand that's part of the nature of a web-based delivery system, is that the end nodes are not within our control. People will do things you never expect. Users can be incredibly inventive in the crazy things they do. So even though you write an application and say, well, no one would ever answer it this way, you can be sure someone will. So anticipate the oddest, most extreme behavior by users when you're writing your application. I see a question from Reese. Does anybody else lost audio? I assume I'm being heard. Can someone confirm that the audio is good?
I can hear you.
I can still hear you.
Okay, I'm hearing no. So perhaps you can chat to Reese that the rest of us are hearing audio. Okay, and one last thing from your point of view as developers, also the server, LHI itself. You don't control it. You rely upon the LHI team to keep it patched and bug-free and upgrade it. So all you can do is focus on your application and make it behave as well as you possibly can. So how do you do that? One aspect, of course, is to test. We've talked about this a few times, I'm sure, across these 5 weeks. Working with A to J and with hot docs, you can do a lot of testing at all stages, and we heartily encourage testing basically at every point. When you write a component in hot docs, there's a handy test button on the bottom left of nearly every editing dialog. Test your computation, even if it seems trivial. Make sure it's producing the results you want. You can select part of a hot docs template just by highlighting it and test it in isolation. You can test the entire template. This test assembly button is right there in the middle of the button bar. Then in hot docs you can also emulate the online experience by going to template test in browser, JavaScript, and see how the template will behave when it's transformed into a web experience rather than a Windows desktop experience. Once you've uploaded a template to LHI, you can test it there. You've now got a link. It's not necessarily going to behave exactly the same way it did on your desktop, even in online emulation, because there may be differences in the JavaScript version you've got locally and the one on the server. So you really need to test all these stages. Another thing to do when you test is don't keep running the same answer file over and over again and just sort of smiling because it's doing the right thing. Create separate answer files for variations and make some of them extreme. And keep a few handy for different permutations of answers and see if your template behaves well under each of these different answer scenarios. Involve other people. As the developer, you become blind to certain aspects of your application. So you want to get other people of various kinds, experts and people that are close to your end users, to test to see what they do differently in the experiences they have. When you are using LHI as your test medium and you've got beta testers, they can save their answers just like anybody can who's got an account, and they can share their answer files with you. So if somebody runs your application, says, hey, I got the wrong document, it will help you a lot if they can share the answer file they used so you can replicate the mistake they uncovered. And then, of course, you want them to be as specific as possible in describing the problem. Hot Docs has got a number of tools to help you. I think I've touched on a couple of these already, but first of all, you want to enable your template for server in the component file properties. Then if you attempt to do something that server doesn't support, Hot Docs will alert you and prevent you. You can unit test as you go along, again by pressing the test button on each component editor. Assemble the template in whole or in part, test in browser. And I covered this point about the JavaScript. May not be identical with that on the server. A few other things, I think Bart may have mentioned some of these in past trainings, but there is the ability in the Hot Docs toolbar to produce an outline of your template. And when you click that, a separate pane will appear in your word processor in Word that'll show you the logical outline of your template with all the ifs and the repeats broken out. And often that's a good way to see if there's some kind of a structural problem with your template. You can label the ifs and the repeats both in sequence and in nesting and turn that on or off. That's usually a very helpful technique with a complex template. We've seen the template manager, which lets you take a template or a library of templates and analyze them and come up with all the variables that are in any of them, which are used, which are not used, which have defects. And that's a great way, ideally before you publish, to see if there's any errors Hot Docs itself discovers. There's a whole testing machinery inside of Hot Docs we have not covered, but you can turn on a test panel and a debug mode and step through any aspect of your interview and see what Hot Docs is doing to the various variables. So if you get a complex template and you can't figure out what's going wrong, that's one of the options to consider. There's a whole section in help about that. Definitely worth doing. In the desktop and pretty soon on server itself, we're supporting document preview. So as you're running an interview, you can see what the document looks like, change your answers, do a what-if analysis, and switch between the interview and the set of answers and the document in preview. And finally, you do want to get the latest version of Hot Docs. There are updates periodically. Some are free, some are paid. In general, it's highly recommended to stay on the current version of Hot Docs Developer if you're part of this community. If you fall behind, there may be bugs inside the developer license itself, inside the developer software, and you'll be missing out if you don't have the latest updates. How do you involve other people? Um, if you're not a domain expert yourself, you can turn on what's called markup view. Again, it's on the hot docs button bar or the menu, and it'll take some of the syntax, the if, and, else kind of syntax, and turn it into a little more intelligible form with brackets, etc. That might be easier for a domain expert to review. So you can turn that on momentarily, print it out, or send the other person a copy, and then they can go through and say, well, yeah, this paragraph really should only occur under these circumstances, and you haven't quite nailed the circumstances in which it should occur. Having another developer, somebody who knows hot docs, is another methodology to say, hey, would you mind looking at this template? Look at this application. What do you see with fresh eyes that may be wrong or could be improved about it? And when you have other people testing, you want to include both, as mentioned, those with expertise who really know the subject matter cold, and people who are coming at it totally fresh, especially if they're ones that are in your target audience. Once the applications are up on LHI, there is a mechanism for users to click a button and to send you feedback. So if you're the registered developer for a piece of content on LHI, you may find yourself getting such feedback via email. And unless it's just highly complimentary and praiseworthy, you want to act on the feedback and fix things. I already mentioned running different answer scenarios. Don't keep using the same answer file. That's a common mistake I fall into myself. You've got a test answer file, that's what you're always running, and everything behaves, and then as soon as you start a fresh one, you realize it's not working quite as well. Try not answering questions. So again, it's usually not a good idea to require questions in hot docs, because that makes it hard for somebody to enter partial information, save their work, and return, because hot docs will not let you finish if there's required fields left unanswered. But so when you're testing, try omitting questions. Make sure your document comes out as expected, or again, script explicit handling of insufficient answer scenarios so that documents are not generated. Try making mistakes. Do things you can't imagine anyone ever doing. Enter $5 million, or for a filing fee. Enter 1,010 for somebody's age. Try just making very extreme answers and see if the system is designed to handle it. Have you built in constraints? Have you built in ranges, for instance, on numbers, so that really weird numbers will just elicit an error message to the user? Keep a log as you're working, some sort of a documentation, either on paper or on in your computer, of what you've done, what you've fixed. And because like most of us, you're deep in an application, you fix a problem, tomorrow or next week you're going to forget how you fixed it and why. And backing up is another key strategy. You can back up your work. You should back it up periodically. Have a backup folder in your template directory. Hot docs, when you assemble a hot docs template, it automatically puts a copy in a different file directory. But backups are really valuable. Things go wrong. You make some catastrophic mistake. You accidentally delete a bunch of stuff, and you'll be very thankful you had a backup to save you from having to recreate everything. So, as far as methodology, focus on quality, avoiding errors, producing an experience that actually is useful, usable, etc. Take advantage of the tools you have, the built-in features in hot docs, the community we've built around Will Help Interactive, and other kinds of colleagues. Have a test plan. Make the testing an explicit part of your development project. You should consider spending at least half as much time testing as you are developing. It seems strange, but very often that's essential. Test as thoroughly as possible, consistently, constantly. Monitor your template once it's up and being used, both for any feedback you get and for any changes in the law or practice that you need to address. And when the law changes or enhancements occur to you, or feedback is presented that identifies errors, fix them, maintain, update, and go through the same testing process for such maintenance. Okay, standards. We don't have any absolute standards. There are very few standards that you have to comport with, but there are a lot of conventions that have emerged over the last decade with people doing this kind of work in the national legal aid community. And some of these come from the Legal Services Corporation. If you've got a TIG grant, they will insist upon or highly recommend you following certain conventions. Different states will have different standards, and your local community may have standards. Why bother following them? First of all, if you've got a variety of end users using your templates, standards will enhance the usability and effectiveness of the applications for them. If you have information being gathered for 3 or 4 different stages, for instance, of a divorce proceeding, you don't want to have the same information given different names in the different templates. There should be a common name for the variables in question, so the user is not being asked the same question twice. They can use an answer file from template number 1 in connection with template number 2, 3, and 4. Standards-based development that generally results in lower cost both for developing and for maintaining the templates. To the extent you're reasonably consistent with conventions others follow, your work product will be shareable and usable, and it's easier to communicate with the domain experts that you're working with. We do have a document. This is a screenshot of an earlier version, but this is available on the DA support site. I'll come back to this later. But it's a collection of standards and practices for these kinds of applications that go through general principles, various standards you might consider in the user interface, and specifically on naming of components. And that's always a big topic. We've tried in this course to model some good naming conventions, but we highly recommend that you do adopt some explicit naming conventions. On the interface, there are things like, how do I ask questions? Do I put a colon after each prompt or not? How do I lay out my dialogues? Do I use the fact that you can do horizontal layout of up to 3 items on a line, or do I make it all just one vertical stack of questions? To what extent am I defaulting answers? Think about these things that may come up in more than one context in a specific application or across applications, and try to standardize them at least within your own universe of templates. When it comes to development, you'll find yourself often with options as far as a variable type. Should I make this telephone number a text variable or a number variable? That's kind of an easy one, as we've seen. Both telephone numbers and social security numbers and zip codes often are done as text because they will have non-numeric characters in them. But there are other situations where you may be able to use a true-false variable or a multiple choice. Which do you use? Whatever you do, once you've decided which makes sense for context A, when context B arises with the same kind of choice, try to do the same consistent design decision. There are other places, I'll get into component naming in just a second, but how do you script things? Do you put comments in your scripts? How do you modularize? How do you organize the templates you're working on? How do you name your files? And what titles do you give them? As you encounter these things, don't always just focus on the specific immediate context, but think, is this a way I would like to do this going forward? So let's talk about variable naming. These are all different ways in which you might name a variable to hold a child's name. And we've probably seen almost all of these in various templates. These are all legal names. I think you'll see the one we tend to prefer in LHI and is this one here, where we have just an initial capital. We use spaces, not underscores. We include a 2-letter data type abbreviation at the end. But there's no absolute rule about this. But I think the more you will settle on a standard, the better you'll be. There's an elaborate document in that Standards and Practices memo I just showed you that talks about all of these aspects. What letters should you capitalize? Should you use spaces or not? Yes is our general answer. They're much more readable. Should you put these 2-letter data type indicators? We highly encourage that. It makes good sense for a variety of reasons. You want to keep the length as short as possible, but long enough to be meaningful. You want to choose words that actually describe carefully the information your variable is meant to contain. You want to sequence the words generally so the most important concept is up front. So it'd be something like plaintiff, name, first, TE would be a way to handle that. That way when you sort them on your component manager, they'll come up in logical groupings. But all of these things do involve some trade-offs. There are reasons not to do what we recommend, and you need to decide what best suits your needs. When it comes to documents, you'll have a lot of decisions there about standards depending upon the complexity. If it's a PDF document, you have questions about the fonts you use to merge your answers onto the form, and whether they should be centered in the box or left centered, how big you want your check marks to be, etc. In a Word document, how do you want to merge the answers? What kind of formats do you want to use for dates and numbers? To what extent are you using built-in styles in Word? Again, highly recommended. But just a taste of the kinds of aspects of development, excuse me, that should be considered when you're building a project. So that's really the substance of your work. Some process practices to mention. And I realize I'm going fast. These slides will be available afterwards if you want to read them more slowly. One thing I certainly highly recommend is when you start a project, have an explicit action plan. Document what you're doing, why, for whom, what you're not doing, what you're saving for phase 2, who's doing what, on what schedule. Have an action plan that's written out, shared with your team, with your funder if necessary, and that articulates the plan before you dig into it. So it might look like something like this. This is an ancient one for a SSI project, but a simple word table is good. What are we doing? What are the reasons for this project? What are some principles we're going to follow as we go through it? What challenges do we anticipate? What is in, what is out as far as the scope of the project? Who's going to be using it, etc. So that's a technique that I encourage. If you're not the substantive expert yourself in the area you're working on, you got to work with other people. So how do you work with the substantive expert? Some general tips and principles, get them involved as early as possible. They should be part of this action plan designing and anticipating the scope and the nature of the project. On the other hand, expect them to be slow getting back to you sometimes. They're generally very busy, so you got to accommodate delays. I know Bart and I, in our various projects, often that's the most complicated part of working is getting the input of the end users who have the expertise that we need as the developers. You can do various things. You can have your expert mark up their documents. I think in this course we had a little bit of markup in the Montana dissolution template, where there's some guidance where somebody went through and said, yeah, use this sentence under these cases, use this sentence under those cases. So if you've got documents that are your source documents, you can ask your expert either on paper or in their word processor to add annotations to explain. That can clarify some of the logic. They can also help you draft the questions that the users will see. You want to the extent you can get them to do it, get your experts to test the application to create the content of the guidance. And ideally, there'll be somebody who's got a stake in the end product, so they've got an answer to the question of what's in it for me. For markup, there's no magic formula for how to mark up documents. It's just a method for communicating requirements, not an end in itself. So this is an example of an extreme markup strategy. Here somebody went through a very simple letter and using word comment features, highlighted every little piece of information and said what's going to be in here. It's rare you'll get anybody to do this kind of level of markup, but it's an extreme to aim for. Once you've done this a little bit, you've got an idea of what markup will be most useful to you. So if you've got an expert who's willing to spend some time doing it, marking up, give them example. Give them some standards, some guidance on how to mark up the content that'll make your life easier. But expect it to be imperfect. If somebody's got their own way of explaining things, take it. You can often get multiple variations of a single document and use the automatic document comparison tools to generate red lines that will surface variations that you then can point to an expert and say, hey, why are these two different? What is it about the two cases that means that accounts for this difference? Another thing that I mentioned on that prior slide is using a spreadsheet. So some people find this technique handy, where you just use Excel or whatever spreadsheet you like to, before you even program in HotDocs, to identify the names of the variables that you expect to use, and the prompt that you would have for them, what type it's going to be, whether or not you're going to require it, whether or not it's repeating information, what dialogue it's going to go into. In other words, design your entire expected HotDocs interview outside of HotDocs. This then might be easier for an expert to review and give you feedback on how things are phrased. Then when you're ready and you've got it all figured out, you then copy and paste from here into the HotDocs developer. One thing we developed probably 6 or 7 years ago now is a system kit. This was a TIG project supported by, it was by LSC through Legal Assistance of Western New York, that took about a dozen family law projects and built a kind of a starter kit for other people doing similar projects. And it's available free to LSC grantees. You can write to me at this address under this other company called Legal Systematics. And what it is, it's a HotDocs library that has a component file with, I think, 500 or 600 components already in it. So a lot of common variables you would need in a family law application, associated dialogues, computations, with documentation for a lot of it, example templates, example PDF forms, various documentation about how to design and plan a family law LHI project. So that is available free if you're doing a family law project. Even if you don't use this, it would probably be helpful to you to grab a copy and to peruse it. So I'm going to stop this segment here with this slide, which is, I guess, some high-level principles. When you're doing these applications, try not to reinvent more than you have to. As I believe we've covered, there's a template portal on LHI. Search for content someone else has already done. Grab it, steal it, reuse it, improve it. Don't reinvent it. Pay some attention to practices, standards, conventions. Be aware of what's already out there. Don't feel bound to follow them, but if you don't have a better idea, you're probably better off living within the conventions. Try, at least within your own work, to be as consistent as possible from one application, one context to another. Don't get paralyzed by standards. Don't be worried about not being exactly compliant. And finally, as you learn and become proficient in this kind of development effort, jump in, pass on your expertise to other people, get involved. And we'll come back to some of the ways in which you can get involved with others in the final section. Let me stop there and pass the baton to Bart to talk about providing guidance. And if anyone has questions or comments while we're transitioning, please feel free to speak up.
Okay, if there are no questions, I'll get started on our next segment, which is providing guidance to users. So I have the HotDocs library open that has our template in it, and I'm going to open the template for editing. There are a variety of ways in which you can provide guidance to users, and we did have in the prior class, you saw a couple of examples, and I'll just review that briefly. There is, I'm going to open the component manager for this template, and I'm going to go to the petitioner information dialog. And one of the things you saw was that for a dialog, you can associate help or resources with a particular dialog. So in this instance, you would go to the resource tab, as you saw in a previous class, and you would choose plain text or URL help and put that right into the resource for the dialog, and that help will be available to the user as soon as the dialog is presented in the interview. There's also, as you saw previously, help resources or help can be associated with a particular variable in the interview. So in this instance, we had added the petitioner information, or this text here, to the petitioner first name. The petitioner is the person starting the case. And that those are kind of two examples of how you can use resources or help, topic-specific help for the user. You can also add scripting to a plain text resource. In other words, this text does not have to be static. You can add scripting here to make this dynamic, so that information can change depending on previous answers that the user has given in the interview. And in earlier versions of HotDocs, the only way to do that was on server was to use a computation, but you can now put the logic right on the face of the resource. And the way you do that basically is you can put chevrons around the logic. If you have if statements, if you have end if statements, if you put the HotDocs chevrons around them, you can also use variables and put chevrons around them. So anything within chevrons will be interpreted by HotDocs as a field, and anything that's just plain text, like this sentence here, is going to appear exactly as you type it in the resource. Sometimes it's easier to use a computation for scripting resources because you don't have to necessarily use the chevrons. So you can have, just an if and an end if right in the computation without the chevrons, and sometimes that's easier to manage than actually having to do the chevrons. The one thing about the help or the resources, when you add resources to variables and to dialogues, is that it's not always obvious to the user exactly how that the help is available. Because if you, for example, in this instance, let me do a test assembly by holding down the Shift key and clicking on Test Assemble. So I'm doing a browser test in browser interview at this point. So bring up my interview. So in the petitioner information here, there is a view resource that's available to the user. So if they know, if you've given them information to click on that view resource, they can see a pop-up. You can also give them general instructions on how to show the resource pane, so that they can open up the resource pane over here. But it does require a little bit of advanced knowledge on the part of the user, because they may not know, unless you tell them somehow, what this resource button means or how the resource pane works. So there's another way that you could provide help to the user, and you can also script that help, which is to use a dialog element. So let us do that, and we're going to open up go to the component manager and open up the petitioner information dialog, and we're going to add a dialog element to give the user a warning if they select a state for the petitioner other than Montana. So I'm going to go down here and click on the Create New Dialog Element. And as you saw in a previous training, there are different types of dialog elements. In this instance, we want to use the default, which is text, because we just simply want to show text on the surface of the dialog when the user makes does something that they really should be considering not doing. So we're going to call this dialog element warning about state DE. And we're going to put as text warning if petitioner is not a resident of Montana, this application may not be suitable. And we're going to replace, if I do a test, I can save this. I'll just do a test. I'm going to move this up to right underneath the petitioner state. I'm going to do a test. So you'll see the warning is appearing here. Actually, what I should do is move it below the zip code, I believe. Do a test. So you'll see that that warning is now appearing in all instances, and it's really not appropriate if the user has not chosen a particular state. And also, I can make my help or my resources or my warnings to the user a little more user-friendly by personalizing it a bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag and drop the petitioner first name variable into my dialog element, and I just dragged and dropped it into the wrong place. So I'm going to cut it, and I'm going to paste it so it replaces the word petitioner. And I'll click OK. And one of the things, I'm not going to get into it here. Well, actually, we can do it, but we're not going to do it right now. Is that if you test this, for example, you'll notice that petitioner first name TE, the name of the variable is appearing here because the first name's auto answered. If I answer the name, then the name appears. If you have this kind of situation in a template, you do need to deal with what happens if this is not answered. So what you could do is you could add logic to the warning so that if the user has not answered the first name, it puts in some generic text like petitioner. I can also, as you've seen in previous training classes, we can also make this bold if we want to really draw attention to the user's attention to it. So we can do character format and make it bold, like so. Finally, we don't want this warning to show unless the user has indicated that they're in a state other than Montana. So to do that, I can go into the dialog script and I can add logic to the dialog script that hides the dialog element until it becomes relevant. So dialog elements can be grayed and ungrayed. You saw previously that those two techniques are available for disabling or hiding variables, or you can hide the variable or you can gray it so it's disabled. You can also do the same thing with dialog elements. In this instance, what we want to do is we want to hide it. So I'm going to say hide warning about state DE. So by default, it's going to be hidden. But if the petitioner state does not equal Montana, Montana, show warning about state DE, and if. So the The exclamation point followed by the equal sign is an operator in HotDocs that means does not equal. It's kind of a neat shorthand way of showing, saying if this value that the user has entered does not equal this value, then do something. In this case, it's going to be to show the warning. So I'm going to hit OK here. I'm going to open my petitioner information dialog, and I'm going to do a test. And I'm going to go down. First of all, I'll answer the first name, and then it's defaulted to Montana, but I'll change it to New Hampshire. And my warning appears: if Homer is not a resident of Montana, this application may not be suitable. And I've got a typo in my dialog element for the text, so I can right-click here and edit dialog element, go up here, and just get rid of that second may. Click OK. And then I can do an update. Clicking on the update button, it returns me to the dialog, and it shows me the dialog with the correction made. And this is, Mark had talked in his session about unit testing and testing dialogues, and your warnings in the dialog this way is a good example of unit testing that you can do immediately when you've done some scripting to make sure that it's working properly. I'm not going to save my answers. There are other ways your interviews more friendly. In addition to providing guidance and information to users, you can also make it easier for them to navigate, and you can provide them with a nice context in which to operate. One example of that is in a repeating dialogue, and I'm going to open up the children here. If I do a test of this dialogue, by default, for all repeating dialogues, HotDocs adds this, has a button down, or all repeating series dialogues, it has an add another button down here, which is kind of the generic text that will appear unless you change it. That's a little bit unfriendly. You know, it could stop somebody. They might say, well, add another what? So you can customize that text by going to the options for the dialogue, and I'm sorry, in the properties of the dialogue, there's a add button text here. So here we can say add another child. And when I update it, I'll click OK. I'll do a test of my dialogue. Now I have a little friendlier button that says add another child, which as soon as the user answers a question on this dialogue, they can then click that add another child, and the other add another appears. Another way that you can make your interviews more friendly is to provide some context for the user in terms of the beginning of the interview and the end of the interview. So if I go into my interview, right now my interview only contains dialogues that are prompting the user for information. But I can also add dialogues that serve the sole purpose of providing the user with information. And if I want to create what oftentimes developers will do is they will have a dialogue that welcomes the user to the interview and tells them what interview they're in. They may have some knowledge from the links that they've clicked on to get here to the interview. They may have some knowledge of what it is they're trying to do, but it's nice and friendly for the user to add some information right in the interview. And you can do things like add your organization's logo, for example, to the dialogue. So I'm going to go ahead and create a dialog here, which I'm going to call welcome. And I'm going to give it a title. I'm going to add a dialog element here by dragging and dropping the dialog element icon up into the dialog. And I'll call this one welcome message DE. And I'm going to make this a horizontal divider. And I'm going to give this a caption, which will display to the user, of welcome to the Montana divorce template. And I'm going to make this center justified. And just for the heck of it, let's make it 200% of the size of the dialog font. So it's a little bigger. I can click on OK. I can test my dialog now. Welcome to the Montana divorce template. I need to make sure that I specifically ask this dialog in the interview. Even if you don't use a custom interview, you have to force HotDocs to ask this dialog, because HotDocs, since it doesn't contain any variables, HotDocs won't consider it as something that it needs to ask automatically. Just save my interview. There's also, if you want to provide more extensive help to users, you can also add links to websites external to your interview, where they can go and read up about extensive material that might not be suitable for inclusion in the interview itself. So I'm going to add another dialog element here, and I'm going to make this one, call this one general help DE, and I'm going to make this a web link. And I'm going to go and copy from the homework that you'll be getting. There's a URL. I'm going to copy and paste that into the URL for
It's there on the right part of your
yeah. What's that?
It was there. The new dialogue on the right there.
Yeah. I'm going to paste it right in here, and I'm going to give it some friendly text. I'm going to include the link text. Click this link for general information about divorce in Montana. I'll click on OK. So I now have, I'm just going to save my dialog. So I now have a complete, more or less complete welcome dialog. I might want to add other text to it. And I can test this dialog, and you can see there's a button here that shows up that I can click on to open up the Montana Law Help website under the specific topic of divorce. One thing to be aware of about using web links in interviews is that you really, if you do it, I think you need to give the user some information about what's about to happen and tell them how to navigate back to the interview, because you'll notice that the interview opens in a separate, even if I was on LHI and I was running a web-based interview, the URL is in a separate browser window. And this can be confusing to users because basically now they're completely removed from the interview. So you would probably, if you were going to use a web link here, you'd probably want to put in some text that explains to them what to do to get back to the interview. Or at least tell them that they're going to be taken to a separate website and that they'll have to get back to the interview. Click on OK. Another thing that you can do is that you can include help or include a dialogue at the end of your interview that explains to users that they're basically done. So if I do a test assemble, for example, in desktop HotDocs, one of the things that will appear, unless you disable it, is this end of interview. Basically tells you you're done with the interview, and it sort of signals to the user that they've reached the end. If I do a test in browser interview, you'll see the behavior is quite different. Here, there is no end of interview dialogue. So they come to the end of the interview, and it's not clear exactly where they are as far as the interview is concerned. And if you hit finish, it gives you the unanswered questions, and it tells you that you're finished with the interview. But it's kind of nicer. I'm going to get rid of that. It's kind of nicer in some instances to tell the user that they're done and tell them even what to do next to get their document. So if I go back into my interview, I'm going to go down to the end of the interview, and I'm going to add an end of interview dialogue, basically. I'll call this dialogue finished, and I'll add a dialogue element called finish message DE, and I'll say, congratulations, you've completed the interview. And then you could add more text here telling them, what to expect next, or how to finish, or click next or finish to continue, get your document, whatever the case may be. So I would have to add, obviously have to add this dialogue to my to an ask in the interview. So I've kind of bracketed the interview here with an ask that welcomes them to the interview and an ask that tells them when they're finished. So I can now do a test in browser interview. And I get this nice welcome screen. If I go to the end, I also get a finished, or congratulations, or whatever you want to call it, at the end of the interview. And again, if you have a dialogue like this that only has a message for the user, you've got to force HotDocs to ask it. If you're using a custom scripted interview, then you can specifically add the ask. If you're using a if you're trying to do a template without a custom interview, then you would have to put an ask in the body of the template or in a computation in the body of the template in order to get these to be asked. And you'd have to make sure that you position the asks so that the welcome gets asked first, which means you'd have to put it at the top of the template, and then you'd have to put the finished at the bottom. Once you're done with adding the help to the interview, you can do a save and close to save and close your template. There's one other thing that I wanted to mention that you may want to consider using in terms of help, which is something that's new in HotDocs, which is the error text keyword. So I'm going to go into petitioner information, and I am going to go to my script here, and I'm going to set, I'm going to say, I'm going to actually comment out. You can add a couple of forward slashes. Actually, I'm going to keep that hidden. I'm going to comment out showing the about state dialog element. And I'm going to add here and this is assuming not that here that we're not even going to let the user use this template really if they're not a resident of Montana. And I'll show you what this does. So this is something new, as I said, that was added to HotDocs. I will do a test of this, and I will change Montana here to New Hampshire. And what it does is it adds in red at the top of the interview the error text message. And if I try to continue, it pops up a dialog that says, tells me that I basically can't continue unless I'm a resident of Montana. So this is similar to requiring an answer. If the answer is required, then the user has to answer. In this instance, I'm not even letting the user continue unless they meet that particular requirement. Some people don't like this, the way this appears, because it's at the top of the dialog. There's no way to position it in the dialog, so you really want to have a warning message that appears. If it's about the state, you want to have a warning message that appears about the state below the state. But you probably could use this in combination with a dialog element similar to the one that we created earlier that warns the user about Montana. So you could have a general message that says, you know, there's a problem with the information you provided, and then refer them to the message down here. But that's just something new that was added to HotDocs that you might want to consider using. And that really
It's a question, Bart.
question. Let me see what the question is. Okay, so the question is, if you don't default the state to Montana, would it throw the error before you even get to that screen? And that's a good question. We can try it. I think the answer is yes, but let's comment that out and do a test. And well, actually the answer is no. So the question has to be answered before the error message will appear. And you might want to, I mean, the error text can be, you can have incredibly complex logic associated with the error text. And you can have the error text, there's only one error text, but you can have it set to different things, a combination of things. For example, if the user has given the wrong answer to 2 questions, you can have a script basically that says, you know, set the error text to this and this if both of these things are true, but otherwise just set it to the one thing if one thing is true. So you can do pretty fancy stuff with it, but once again, the message is always going to appear up here. Okay, so any other questions about providing guidance to users in the interview?
Bart, you can have variables in error text just like you can have them in a resource, right?
That is correct. Yep.
Yep.
Yep. Other questions?
There's one from Sharon Gant in the chat.
Hi. Yeah. I've noticed the thing that said script link, and I was just wondering how would that work? That seemed the least clear to me.
Oh, a script link basically runs a computation. So you can specify a button in the interview basically that will run a computation. you know, it's hard to think offhand of an example of exactly how you might do it. I use it pretty rarely. There is one there is one system that we maintain where there's a very complex script that runs to set various values, and what we found was that when you set, if you just automatically set those values in the interview, then the interview slows to a crawl. So, and these are very sophisticated users who use the system, so they know that they're able to use a button basically that appears in the interview to do the setting for them. And that's basically what a script link does. So if you have a computation that if there's something you want to do behind the scenes in the interview and you want to give the user control over whether or not that thing happens, you know, another example is that setting things to the usual defaults. You know, if there's sort of a common set of choices, for example, for the user, and you don't want to force them to answer every single question in those common set of choices, you could have a button that sets the values of various things based on, you know, the script. And that's actually a pretty good use of set, because when the script runs, it's only going to run when the user clicks on the button. And it's a button just like the button that you saw for the web link.
Okay.
And you can specify, I'll just open the component manager.
So if the person is the more average user or something, or more common, then they can set it, and otherwise they can go through and
Exactly.
answer.
Yeah, you're basically giving the user control over something that happens, and anything that you can do in a hotdocs computation, you can do in that script. So if you do, I'll just pretend I'm doing a new dialog element here. So if you do script link, so you have to give it a name, obviously. All dialog elements, like all components, have a name. Then you have to specify a computation. None of these computations would be appropriate because they don't, you know, they're all resolved to things rather than doing something. And then you add text here, so you can add, you know, the friendly text that appears when the button shows up. And that's basically what a script link is. I think, you know, you probably can spend years developing hotdocs templates and never use it, but it is good to know what it is.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep. Other questions?
One example, Bart, of that script link that we've used, when you've got a complex template set where there's maybe a couple dozen documents and forms you might generate based upon different answers by the user, and you've got a dialog that has a bunch of checkboxes for which documents do you want to generate today. We've added a button there to pick the common package for a given county, right? So you press the button, and all of a sudden, all of the choices are pre-selected for you, and that turns out to be quite handy.
Other questions? So I think if there are no more questions, I'll turn it back to you, Mark. You can do the final segment.
Okay. Alrighty, folks. Let's see. Make myself presenter. So you will get from Miranda this homework document as usual that has pretty much an explicit set of instructions for replicating what Bart just did as far as creating helps and warnings and other things. So I encourage you to do that as your last piece of the homework for this 5-week series. I'm going to wrap up with another slide deck about continuing your education. And this just really is an attempt to give you a feeling for the wealth of things that are out there to help you. If you're feeling somewhat lost or needy of more help, there's plenty of such help to be found. Falls into 3 categories: various general kinds of information, some things that are specific to hotdocs, things that are specific to A to J. Most of these are available in a document called LHI Developer Resources, which I've got, let me see here, in at the back of your homework. So the homework you'll get will have at the bottom of it a two-page listing of resources with links, etc. So I'm basically just giving you a preview of all these things that are in your homework document. Okay. This is an older version of that document I just showed you. Be aware of. I think this is definitely something you want to look at soon after you finish this training. There is the DA support website. Most of you have signed up for this. This is maintained by Pro Bono Net. It's really our main library of materials to support both the technical and organizational project management aspects of these kinds of applications. The National Technology Assistance Project, or NTAP, is another resource. They've got a website. They've got a section on document assembly. I'll touch on that in a bit. We have a listserv or a mailing list called Doc Assembly. You should have already signed up for that, but it's free and easy and high quality. And I think if you're doing any ongoing development, you definitely want to be on that because you'll be able to raise questions, get answers, and get the latest news from fellow developers around the country. Claudia and Miranda run monthly developer calls. I think it's on the 4th Tuesday of each month. So there'll be one next Tuesday, the 25th. And these alternate between technical topics and programmatic or organizational topics. You've seen or will have seen the contributor portal on LHI. So as a card-carrying LHI contributor with such an account, you can sign up and log in and access all the content anyone else in the country or the world, frankly, has ever uploaded to LHI and is making available to their users. And you can download their templates, component files, etc., day-to-day interviews. So it's all a software commons from which you can share. There's an article my colleague Alan Sudikoff and I wrote many years ago called Keys to a Successful Document Assembly Project. It's linked in the resource. And Miranda is putting links to the portal and other things in the chat if you haven't seen. So we also have these calls I just mentioned last Tuesday of the month. We do trainings. We did 2 live trainings. Now we're doing this online training in the fall, and we do usually a live training in January, typically piggybacked against the TIG conference in San Antonio. There's also generally 2 webinars, one technical, one programmatic, that are offered. We have one scheduled, I think, for late November or December, details about which will be in the document assembly listserv. And then Bart and I and our colleagues at Capstone are available. We're under contract to provide personalized support up to a limited amount of time for developers. So if you are doing a project and just can't figure something out, first of all, we encourage you to use the listserv so your questions and the answers can be shared by other people. But if useful, we can set up a web conference, look over your shoulder, get online with you, and help you work through the issues you're dealing with. This is a couple screenshots of the DA support website. This is a pretty dated one, but when you log in, you can get access to the library organized by various concepts, forms, plain language, quality assurance, etc. It's got all kinds of resources, such as all the latest stats about system usage, on and on. Pretty much, and recordings of trainings, recordings of the monthly calls, a vast collection of material that's collected over the last decade or so. LHI has a link, so you can talk directly to the support team by clicking that link. Miranda and her colleagues access that content. They follow the email. So if you have a general question or you run into a bug, you can contact the team that way. And of course, whenever you're raising a problem, the more specificity you can provide, the better. There are periodic newsletters that Miranda and Claudia generate that tell you the latest and greatest about what's going on in the LHI world. And the list, the document assembly list, is archived. So if you've got a problem, it may well be that this has occurred to somebody before, been discussed and resolved, and if you go and search the archive, you may get the answer. This is the contact the present contact button that'll get you to the support team. I believe, Miranda, correct me if I'm wrong. This is the NTAP
That's right.
site. That's right, okay. This is, again, a dated screen print, but NTAP still has general information about document assembly that's not necessarily LHI specific, but often useful and supplemental to what's on the DA support site. That's all our stuff, all the legal aid, pro bono net, legal services supported content. HotDocs as a commercial vendor has a bunch of stuff of their own. Their main website is hotdocs.com. It's a quite sophisticated website with all kinds of stuff in there. That's where you download your trial copy developer and updates. It's got the evaluation guide, the tutorials you've been doing as part of this, this training. You can access the program help, of course, interactively as you're working. Just press F1 almost anywhere when you're in HotDocs Developer and you're into the help. But should you wish, you can also download the full contents of the help as a PDF, kind of like an old software manual. And some of us like to have that printed out. I would recommend very highly that, again, as part of your early work with HotDocs, if you haven't already, spend some time just browsing through the help, because it'll reveal all kinds of features and issues there that you probably have never heard of. And if you encounter a situation where that's important, it's good to know it's there. The help, I think, is quite good, easily searchable, and well designed. On the website, there's also a wiki, sort of a knowledge base of frequent and other kinds of issues that go above and beyond what's in the help. There is a commercial HotDocs forum, another threaded discussion for all the people using HotDocs around the world. I think it's got several thousand members. Once again, it's reasonably high quality, high signal to noise ratio kind of a forum, and you'll find very helpful people, experts there who will jump in. If you ask a newbie question, somebody will probably quickly respond to it. So you can choose how big of a scope you want your questions to appear in by either asking in our legal aid world, which has a few, 100 or so users, or in the broader HotDocs universe, which has a couple thousand. And then in some parts of the world, including Boston, we have user groups that get together every couple months and share notes about HotDocs development. So that's a world to plug into. This is a screenshot of the wiki, searchable. You can find lots of information, all kinds of very esoteric computations and scripts and techniques for handling common problems and issues. Within our world, we have recorded most of these kinds of events, the trainings and webinars, so you can go back and find one that deals with how to do advanced PDF templates or how to handle unanswered questions. A lot of those are there to be reviewed at your convenience. You can access the standards and practices document that I talked about, access us as Capstone, and the family system kit I think I already talked about. These are at LSNTAP. A lot of our earlier trainings are still available there, so you can if you can't find it on DA support, you might find it under LSNTAP. Quite a few. There's literally probably up to 100 different recordings now of things that have occurred in this world. A2J has got its own set of resources. The main site is a2jauthor.org. I'm sure this will be covered more in the supplemental training, but there's a very comprehensive guide and documentation there, various kinds of starter kits. They run their own workshops and sessions and fora, and trainings are recorded. They've got a big collection of YouTube videos broken down into bite-sized chunks that explain both A2J and HotDocs concepts. So if you're doing A2J, you have no excuse for not getting your answers. We talked about the training. There will be a training most likely in the TIG in January. We haven't figured out yet if we've got a critical mass for it and whether it'll be just be a beginner track like this course, or maybe something intermediate, or maybe one focused on management. But stay tuned for information about that. And my final slide is really just generalized advice. Those of you that have spent your time doing this course carefully and doing the homework, I highly recommend you immediately dig into a project if you haven't already, and keep at it. Even a few hours a week will help you from having your skills atrophy. If you step away for a month or two and try to come back, you're going to forget a lot of what we've covered. So schedule time to work on it, keep this alive, use what you've learned, and grow. Periodically come back and review the kinds of things we pointed you to. Try teaching somebody else. That's always a great way to learn. So if you've got a colleague who might be interested in doing some of this, him or herself, enlist them, step into a teaching role. And give back if you've got techniques and even just questions. By raising them in the discussion groups, you're helping other people who may have been afraid to ask or didn't think to ask a question. So this idea of learning in public is highly encouraged. I'm going to stop there. We're essentially done with the intended content for the course, and I just want to take a little time to open it up for general questions, comments, ideas. Anyone want to say anything or raise any questions?
Mark, I just have one comment about sort of resources and what I've observed. Two of the most valuable resources among those that Mark mentioned are the Legal Services listserv and the Hot Docs Forum. And they're really kind of useful for they're kind of go in two different directions. So if you have, for example, a computation that's not working, you've got some complex scripting and it's not working, usually the Hot Docs General Forum is a better place to go for something like that, because you'll hit more people who have encountered the same issue before or can look at it and tell you what's going wrong and that kind of thing. If you have something that's either much more general, if you're developing a family law system and you're wondering how people generally approach certain things, or if it's LHI specific, then the Legal Services Hot Docs listserv is really a better option. The Hot Docs Forum does have a Hot Docs server sub-forum to it, in addition to the general forum, but that's very quiet and not something that you probably would find useful to post there. I'm not saying it never would work, but a lot of times people post things there and they never get a response. So that would be my kind of general comment in terms of where to go for help. In addition to calling us or contacting Miranda and Claudia and saying, send the ambulance.
Yeah. So what do you think? Someone speak up. Has this been helpful? Where's your head at after these 5 weeks of courses?
It's been very helpful for me. I used to do Hot Docs back in what, 5, 6, 7, like that. And then we had a telephone system conversion and a database conversion, and that all just took like 2.5 years of not any of it. And then, I don't know, I just never got back, had some other stuff, medical. So now I'm hoping I can come up with the time, because I do have a lot of other stuff that I have to deal with, SharePoint and the phone system and reporting and crystal reports, and it seems like it's, when I was doing it before, I was always doing it in the basement after work, so there.
Yeah, well, I mean, Sharon, you're a great example, right? Because unless you find a way to squeeze in a little bit of this on an ongoing basis, it's going to be hard to stick, right?
Yes. So I'm going to just do the little things that I want to do on the regular now, and we do have an online intake, and so I can, look at that and see how would I handle this if I wanted to change that, just as practice. I'm not fiddling with it. Bob built this thing, so
yeah. Right.
So.
And I hope for most of you, you'll agree that this does have its fun and satisfying dimensions. I mean, it can be hair-pulling at some days to get things to behave, and tedious to create templates. But there's also this great satisfaction in being able to automate a task, a process, right? And then know that somebody else can now do something they couldn't have previously have done.
Right.
And do so very efficiently.
Right.
I see Deanna is agreeing. I know that's not always the case, Deanna, but it's nice to know sometimes. it's pleasurable.
Well, yes.
Not always, but sometimes, yeah. Other people, anybody else care just to speak up for a second about what you're doing or what you hope to do? We've taken you through, we've made you dangerous.
Well, I can also mention
Keep going.
the one little thing I was hoping to do at this point is to try to make some interviews so that law students can help us with following up on the online intake interviews. So they come in already labeled with the problem type, and so that helps us narrow it down, either bankruptcy or we're doing benefits or one of the problem codes, so we can give them a guide to help us do the interviews more quickly. It takes a while to get them up to speed when they volunteer, so that's a little test practice for me project.
Yeah, that's in the nature again of teaching somebody else to do some of this, right? So you're
Well,
supporting somebody else in the process.
well, I have two other people here with me, but basically I just want these law students to do the interviews for the applicants that come through our online system, and then on
I see. I see.
Yeah.
Not to write the hot docs interviews,
No.
but to use them.
Yes, call the people. Yes.
Yeah. And as most of you know, in some parts of the country, there are law schools that actually have courses now where students, like at Chicago Kent and at Suffolk Law School where I teach, and a few other places, where they have courses in which law students are building these kinds of tools as
That's
part
really
of
great.
their coursework.
That's so interesting.
That's to be encouraged. It's a great educational experience. So highly encouraged to reach out to the local academic establishment if you've got one that might be amenable to providing that kind of support. Hey, Deanna, I just saw a long comment from you. Maybe I don't know if you're audible. You're talking about the dependencies. Maybe this is a conversation I'm not following.
Okay, am I audible? Can you hear me?
We hear you. Yes.
Oh, yay. Okay, so I don't have to write a long novel. It started with a previous message where I said I'm really interested in the idea of exploring the hot docs management training concept.
Okay.
Because I've worked here at the JCC. I worked with the Judicial Council in California, and we manage all the California programs, and well, most of them. And I've been working on creating our own internal documentation process for just kind of the technical pieces of whenever you make a change to a program. What are the steps that you need to do to document that? How do we keep all of this? How do we keep all the backups? All that stuff we're working on here. But what I'd love to see is a more systematized approach on our end to making those updates. And we have updates 6 months. And unfortunately, we are not in control of a ton of things that contribute to that. So that we have a whole statewide process for updating rules and updating forms, and that's all completely out of our hands. And then at some point, we sort of we either find out that there have been changes because we've done our own proactive investigation, or something does finally land on our desk, and we need to make changes to the hot docs. And so I would love to see us be able to kind of get ahead of that in some way, figure out how to work with all the different people who are involved in making those changes so that we can know those things are coming, be able to anticipate them, and then input them in a timely fashion.
Yeah, that's a great cluster of issues. I know we've had at least one webinar, Miranda, in which we talked a lot about. I think Dina Nicotadis from Illinois Legal Aid Online talked about some of her strategies for documenting and tracking templates and updates. So I believe that recording is available. And if there is an intermediate training, that would definitely be one of the topics we would spend a lot of time on.
That'd be great.
Any other questions, comments, topics? We've got a little time left. I don't want to keep you if not. But since we've spent this time together, I thought I'd give everybody a chance to get off anything that's on their chest or issues or wishes or concerns they may have.
Mark, it's Jessica. Can I
Hey,
make
Jessica.
a push? Hi,
Yes,
can
please.
I make a push for everyone to come to the 2 supplemental trainings? So you, especially today, have covered a lot about what hot docs dialogues can look like and how to script in hot docs. But if you're going to be doing have A to J as your front end, then highly recommend coming to my trainings next week and the week after. Miranda put the link in the chat box. And we'll cover things like repeat loops in A to J, how to customize guided interviews with help resources like Bart was showing you today, learn more as pop-ups, and kind of the more pro se focused resources that we have in A to J.
So same time, same place, next 2 Mondays, right?
Yep.
I'm sorry,
So
next 2 Tuesdays. Next 2 Tuesdays.
Yeah, so it'll be a different link because I'll be running it, but
Okay.
I'll record it and they'll be available to you guys as well.
Great. Miranda, anything else from you? Any kind of wrap up from your perspective?
No, just thanks everyone for sticking with the training. It's very intensive, but hopefully very helpful. Thank you for your feedback and ideas for the next training. We'll be circulating an online survey. It'll be very short, but just to kind of allow us to analyze your experience a little bit better as we plan for January and for the next online training as well. So feel free to reach out to myself and to Claudia. We'll be following up also, but if anything comes up, if you want to talk about project planning, and we can connect you also with Mark and Bart for one-on-one technical assistance as well. So thank you, Mark, Bart, and Jess, and thank you also attendees. And I will be posting the recording and the homework pretty shortly.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.